Studio Ghibli has garnered a reputation for being one of, if not the greatest animation studio of all time. It's not hard to see why. Other studios, both in the West and in Japan, have started to see animation more and more as a means to make money. In the West, the colorful visuals, simple stories, the fantastical settings are often used to exploit children who can't exactly form a deep and intricate view of art yet. In Japan this also applies, but much of animation in Japan is also aimed towards adults. Combine it with how many Japanese citizens are overworked and looking for intimacy, and you get a whole new kind of exploitation. This obviously doesn't apply to every piece of animation, it's not all cynical, but it is a pervasive problem. Besides, even if a piece of animation is good, it's usually not because it did something totally different and unique. Studio Ghibli stands out because of this. The films they made don't just have amazing animation and incredible soundtracks, memorable characters with memorable design, and incredibly creative and imaginative worlds. Some of them include themes that are so intricate and profound, and presented in a way so intelligent, it could make an art house filmmaker blush. Miyazaki and Takahata are very much auteur filmmakers themselves. They have a voice. All of these statements can't apply to any other animation studio, even the best of which can often suddenly make something clearly designed to sell toys or exploit the popularity of a successful franchise. Do I think this reputation as best animation studio is deserved? I'd have to watch many more animated films and shows from many more different studios in order to accurately answer the question. But it's no doubt that many of Ghibli's films aren't only enjoyable, but timeless classics. I'd consider some of their films to be some of my favorites of all time, and my standards are pretty high. However, as someone with high standards, especially for animation, Ghibli's accomplishments and strengths are sometimes blown out of proportion in my opinion. I'm not here to be a contrarian, I don't watch films explicitly looking for flaws. When I say that a large chunk of Ghibli films is made up of mediocre and bad films, I say so because I legitimately think so. My way of examining Ghibli as a studio, as well as their films, is a worst to best ranking, starting with the films I believe are bad, then mediocre, eventually working my way up to the films I'd consider to be absolutely masterful, making my arguments as I go along. I won't just be including Ghibli's 21 animated films, however. Obviously Nausicaa will be included since, while it's not actually a Ghibli movie, you can't discuss the studio without talking about Nausicaa. I'll also be talking about Horror's Prince of the Sun, Gush the Cellist, and The Castle of Cagliostro. These are 3 films directed by Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata before they founded the studio in 1985. I believe that in order to better illustrate my opinions, I think examining these 2 artistic powerhouses' careers before their big break is necessary. Also, Studio Ponic. It's a studio largely made up of ex-Ghibli people, and one that's very clearly trying to, at least partially, emulate what made Ghibli successful and unique. Just like the earlier works of the masters, I think answering the question, can Studio Ghibli even be replicated, is an important part of what I want to convey here. That makes for 27 different films. I won't be including films Ghibli merely produced, no TV shows, documentaries, shorts, or anything other than what I just mentioned. Also, as you can probably tell, this is my first ever real serious YouTube video. I know I'm not a very good editor, the presentation for this video is not very good, but if you can please look past that and focus on what I'm actually saying, I would really appreciate that. Same for any feedback or constructive criticism that I can use to make my videos better in the future. Don't have much more to say, so let's just move on to what I think is the worst film of the bunch. The first time I'd watched this film was about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even earlier. At that time, I knew barely anything about film, let alone Ghibli specifically. My expectations were what the general consensus around the film seems to be. It's a simple yet charming little adventure, not amazing but still entertaining. At the time I shared that opinion. When watching the film again not too long ago, I had expected to have the same exact opinion once again. I was actually baffled by how much I hated it. It's the only Ghibli film I can use that word for. This film is based off of a side character in the film Whisper of the Heart, hence the returns part of the title. When Ghibli were approached to make a short video about cats for an amusement park ride, Miyazaki suggested they use some elements from Whisper of the Heart. When the deal fell through, the short video became 45 minutes long, which had the purpose of grooming young talent before finally becoming feature-length. Poor choice of words aside, this is actually important for the point I'm trying to make. Studio Ghibli, for the majority of its existence, relied on the talents of just Takahata and Miyazaki, a bad idea since they aren't going to be able to make an infinite number of films forever. They needed new talent. This film was partially an experiment to see if they can rely on a new director, Hiroyuki Morita, who previously worked on some of their films. Ghibli's desperation to find a successor for their two masters often gets in the way of them creating quality products. This was a small throwaway project, which turned into a big throwaway project, and to me it shows. Granted, the presentation isn't too bad. The animation, at the very least, is quite pretty in many areas. I especially like the Baron's redesign from Whisper of the Heart. It also has one or two jokes that are actually really funny. That's about it though. To me, this is as shallow and lazy as something Illumination would make. You can say they're also harmless fun, but something they don't have is effort and depth. Same with this film. This film's main character is way more passive than active, not having a personality beyond being a generic klutzy anime girl, and sometimes very kind so that a story beat can happen. For the majority of the story, she doesn't even do anything, instead just having to be saved by somebody else. She's barely anything more than a damsel in distress. The Baron is also just a tool for the story, which is embarrassing for the title character. He's nothing more than a generic suave gentleman who's there just to save the girl. The story is constantly propelled forward by details that are clearly just there for that purpose. There's so many conveniences, contrivances, deus ex machinas, coincidences, and so on. Oh no, they heard me when I was loudly talking to myself. I hope that doesn't lead to a misunderstanding. Hey, these crows are here to save us now, out of nowhere. Look, they teleported, but we have this shimmer that shows us where they're going, so this isn't even a conflict at all. Why was this left in the script? No one in this town is seeing or hearing this giant cat parade. Do they have some sort of magic spell that makes them silent and invisible to anyone but the main character? Plus, there's set pieces that are clearly just there for the sake of being there, like the maze or this weird dance that probably made a million adolescent furries cream themselves. There's not even really a good excuse given for why it's there, it just is. There are a bunch of strange loose ends that don't connect to anything else, such as Muta's backstory or how it pretends the main character experienced any growth by the end, even though the film didn't show it at all. I am not kidding when I say that except for like 2 jokes, there is nothing about the story and storytelling I like. Its universe isn't interesting visually, especially when compared to other Ghibli films, and its rules aren't consistent or even established. How can I immerse myself in a world I don't even know basic details about, and the story is built like this? The villain is as generic as they come and definitely not threatening. There isn't really a threatening risk. Even the conflict of the main character slowly turning into a cat is kind of pointless. There's a storyline that the moment it was established I knew exactly how it was going to end, and yeah, take a look at these background characters. Who cares about character design? Let's just turn exaggerated stereotypes into cat people. When one element of your story seems forced or doesn't go together with the others, it's a flaw, but fine, whatever. But when it's every single major and minor element, when anything connecting anything is something which clearly took no effort or thought to think of, you look lazy. This film is lazy, and more importantly soulless. This is the exact type of film Ghibli is known for not making, and while I am absolutely not making fun of its fans, I wish I understood them, because to me, this is bad Whisper of the Heart fanfiction at best. Here's an interesting one. Horus Prince of the Sun, or the Little Norse Prince, or whatever name out of the million it has you want to call it, was Isao Takahata's directing debut, and Miyazaki even animated parts of it. It was made at a time where Japanese animation was much more primitive than it is now, and it's often regarded as an important stepping stone to where we are today. While it failed financially due to poor distribution, it was praised at the time for its complex characters, mature themes, and ability to enchant both kids and adults alike. These are praises which are commonly sung for Ghibli today. Too bad it aged absolutely horribly. It's amusing to see it being praised for its quote-unquote empowering socialist themes, when this compliment is actually referring to the townspeople teaming up to fight the bad guy. something that's now somewhat cliché. Hilda was praised as a complex character, but now a character thinking whether to be on the good guys or bad guys side is considered bare bones on its own. Oh, and believe me, she doesn't have much beyond that as a character. This applies to so many elements of the film. The mayor has a slimy advisor who wants Horace gone from the village for some reason, so he concocts this whole scheme where there's a big misunderstanding, and now this is a storyline that's made fun of for how overused it is. The hero's father dies in the first 10 minutes as a driving point for his journey, and really no other reason. The utter genericness of the villain, the list goes on. This film may have been deep back then, but it's shallow now. Utterly cliché. Even beyond that, the film is fucked structurally. The film shouldn't be named after Horace since he has less of an emphasis on him than Hilda, a side character. So much time is spent in this village doing random shenanigans which are completely removed from the main conflict, which is the quest to defeat the evil wizard Grunwald. The art style is incredibly inconsistent, and take a good look at these unfinished action sequences, yum yum. I get that this was groundbreaking for the time, but it is very much a product of the time. While Japanese live-action cinema from this period and prior is praised and remembered fondly even today, it's not as true for that period's anime.
And besides, how come you have wings?
That's a stupid question. Why does anyone have wings?
This isn't the only massively influential piece of animation the Ghibli duo made in this period. Many shows they worked on are equally influential and important, if not more so, and some of them live on even to this day in one form or another. I live in Israel, and I remember as a child, 3000 Leagues in Search of Mother was strangely popular here, seeing how it's a relatively obscure 70s show and I was born in 2002. It's not like this film is devoid of anything impressive. The opening scene is fantastic. No music, great sound effects, immediately gets you deeply invested in whatever's going on. Dare I say, one of my favorite opening scenes in film. The soundtrack is pretty stellar too. I included this film because I wanted to show that the Ghibli duo was massively creative and influential even before founding Ghibli. I just couldn't really do it with a TV show, could I? They adapted with the times and made things that weren't just impressive for their time, but timeless. This isn't timeless. It's an interesting piece of history, but not much else. Well, this was anything but unpredictable. This is the only Ghibli film with a rotten rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and also the film widely considered to be their worst, Tales from Earthsea. I completely understand why people think this way, because it is a giant, incomprehensible mess. This is an adaptation of the Earthsea novels. Not one novel, many of them, at the same time, all trying to be one 3-act story, as well as the story of Shuna, a graphic novel by Hayao Miyazaki. For some reason, it's also adapted here. The director, Hayao Sangoro, is noticeably a fan of the novels. It doesn't just come across in his blogs or interviews or whatever. When you know what the themes of the books are, it's clear he tried very hard to capture them here. The fear of death, controlling your own emotions, the natural balance of life, it's all stuff that's both in the books and the movie. The problem is, when even the book's author can't make sense of what happened in the film, that's a really, really bad sign. The themes aren't naturally woven together, they are slapped together. At times it feels like the film pretends it explored more than it did. It expects you to be invested when the main character describes his fear of death, but it's something the film did not build up at all. One moment a theme is tackled, then it's forgotten. It's replaced by a different theme, which is supposed to be a satisfying conclusion to the previous theme. That's really not how it works. The same works for this universe's rules. In the books, everything has a true name, and knowing something or someone's true name allows you to control it, which is not something that's smoothly explained in the film, leading to easily avoided confusion. Even if you ignore how confusing this movie is on so many different levels, it's incredibly generic. There is no character you can attach yourself to, because they all feel like moving pieces of cardboard. The villain could have been intimidating if we actually saw anything they did, instead of the movie just insisting they are threatening. What is up with making them androgynous anyway? Is it just for the purpose of making them creepy? If Disclosure included non-American culture, you bet your ass they'd talk about this. There isn't even anything visually interesting either. The books probably made this universe interesting through the story, but this movie doesn't have an interesting story. The story behind the film's production is way more interesting than the actual product as a result. This is Goro's first animated project, not as a director, not as a writer, in general. He didn't even study animation, he studied agriculture. Ursula K. Le Guin, the writer of the books, wanted the father to direct, and he asked to adapt her books to film years earlier. But since he was busy at the time with Howl's Moving Castle, and Takahata was taking a very long hiatus, the studio needed to pull a director out of somewhere. Hey, let's go with Hayao-san. He might not know enough about animation for this gigantic important project, but fascinatingly enough, he always wanted to work in animation. He chose not to be, due to his toxic relationship with his father. He always chose work over his son, and not in the Disney Channel, "My father is working so hard, he and I wish we could just spend a little bit more time together" type of deal. Hayao views his son as a nuisance. His reaction to this film was, it's good that he made one movie, with that, he should stop. At the film's premiere, he walked out in the middle, saying he felt like he was there for over 3 hours. After he came back, and after it ended, he said this and left. Way to be a loving and supporting father. As a child, Goro saw so little of his father, he had to learn about him through his films. Hayao is a perfectionist, and his perfectionism apparently meant he had to work so hard he wouldn't have time for literally anything else throughout his entire career. If you ever thought, "I wish Miyazaki was my grandpa," or something like that, realize you probably wouldn't feel the difference. I'm not saying he's an irredeemable monster. He's not Roman Polanski. He very clearly understands the mindset and even struggles of younger generations, which is something we'll get to later. He has incredibly intelligent worldviews and he's incredibly talented. However, for every intelligent quote, moment of deep and profound insight, there's him being a huge dick.
人工知能で動きを学習させた CG を見せてくれるそうです。
早く移動するっていうのが学習させたやつなんですね。これ頭を使って移動してるんですけど、基本痛覚っていうこの動きがとにかく気持ち悪いんで、ゾンビゲームの動きに使えるんじゃないかっていう、こういう人工知能を使うと多分人間が想像できない気持ち悪い動きができるんじゃないか。一応こんなことをやっています。
毎朝この頃会わないけど身体障害の友人がいるんですよ。でその彼のことを思い出してね、僕はこれ面白いと思って見ることできないですよ。極めて不愉快ですよね。極めて何か生命に対する侮辱を感じます。
これでもほとんど実験なので、
それは分かってます。
その世の中に見せてどうこうってそういうものじゃないんですよ。
それは本当によく分かってるつもりですけど、どこでたどり着きたいんですか。
まあ人間が描くのと同じように絵を描く機械
を作りたいんだ。
はい。
People are making fun of Scorsese for comparing Marvel movies to theme park rides, but at least he didn't insult their audience, Christ. Never meet your heroes is the moral of the story here, and unfortunately that's something Goro couldn't really abide by. He probably wanted to prove to himself and others he could overcome the emotional pressure his father put on his shoulders. At the same time, GHIBLI desperately needed a new director. This film failed critically, yet Goro still wanted to work and GHIBLI still needed a director. Now that Takahata has unfortunately passed away, and Miyazaki is growing older and older, they're kind of stuck with each other. This film probably would have been good if Hayao made it, but once again, fear of the studio's future meant the quality of the product went down. Goro seems like a nice guy. Too bad when he needed the success the most, it didn't pay off. After Miyazaki's disgusting initial reaction, he sent his son a memo which said, "It was made honestly, so it was good," which made Goro cry. While I don't think this film is good, this phrase describes my feelings towards it strangely well. I said The Cat Returns is the only Ghibli film I hate. I don't hate something unless I think it deserves it, and this film doesn't. Goro made it honestly. He tried, I know he did. You should give the soundtrack a listen, for example. Sure, it may not be as good as something Joe Hisaishi would compose, but it's still decent and still fits the movie very well. A definite sign that effort was put into the film. While Goro didn't live up to Ghibli's reputation in terms of quality, he did in spirit.
I'm going to fly for you.
Yeah, I don't like The Wind Rises. I found it to be incredibly boring, as a matter of fact. Miyazaki's father was a manufacturer of airplane parts, and ever since his childhood Miyazaki's been fascinated with flying and aircraft. It's apparent in every single one of his films, and it's especially apparent here since, you know, it's about an airplane designer. This is easily the most grounded film he's ever directed. It's the only one with no fantasy elements. Instead, it's very loosely based on a real World War II airplane designer, Jiro Horikoshi. When I say loosely, I mean very loosely, since it's also combined with a novel called The Wind Has Risen. There are three main reasons I found the film to be dull: uninteresting characters, lack of conflict, and lack of focus. The only time the main character shows a shred of emotion is in the final scene, and the only real conflict is in the last 30 minutes. And even then you can barely call it that, because not only do you not care about any of the characters, the film seems way too concerned with being pleasant. Even when characters should be in real physical danger in the prior 90 minutes, they seem emotionally unaffected and come out unscathed. So you have a character whose only character trait is his fascination for aircraft, is constantly very nice and barely shows emotion, doing something with no real risk or danger for 90 minutes. It gets very dull very fast. Even these last 30 minutes with literally anything going on, it's mostly a result of an incredibly forced romance plot that was barely built up prior. His love interest is just as much of a blank piece of paper as he is, and any real consequence of the protagonist's actions happens off screen. The majority of emotion in this film comes from dull characters being sad, rather than anything actually happening that would make the audience sad. If I wasn't aware of Miyazaki's love for aircraft, I would have assumed this film was only made to rack up awards. Say what you will about the King's Speech, at least the characters there had character. The film is honest, and that honesty came across to some people. I really loved this film's presentation. The animation is super smooth and highly detailed, and the score is fantastic, something you're gonna hear me say many different times as the video goes on. However, the kind of films I like are the ones that aren't just honestly made, but also meticulously crafted. Miyazaki often storyboards his films before having a script, and he forms the story in his head as he goes along. It could be that he didn't really know where to take the story, but had an idea for one. However, another possible reason I find this film to be his weakest is that he might just be getting old and losing his touch. I think this is the perfect time to bring up his retirement, which he announced after completing this movie. He unretired though, and is now working on a new film called How Do You Live? News sources often say he came back because he wanted to make something for his grandson, but that's according to Toshio Suzuki, Ghibli's producer. This is the reason Miyazaki gave in an interview with him.
まだ未発表の最新作の現場、ぼかしばかりでごめんなさい。宮崎さん、一度こう引退されるとこう宣言されたじゃないですか。はい、それをまたこう撤回してまた作業されているっていうのに何か理由があるんですか？
いや、理由なんかないですよ。またやりたくなっただけの話なんですけど。
僕らとしては非常に嬉しいことなんですけど。いや、
そんな喜ばないから、というよりも、本当に引退したくなるんですよ。これ本当なんですよ。ところが何年か経つうちにやってみたくなるんだよね。しょうがないよね。またですかって感じですけど、毎回いい加減に決めてるんじゃないんですよ。これは体も持たないし、もうヨレヨレだって。それで時間ができるとうろうろ歩き回ってね、なんかだんだん体調が整ってくるとやってないことがあるとかね、あ、この領域には俺全く手出してなかったなと思ってと言ってるうちになんかできるかもしれないと思い始めたのが運動好きなんですね。
First of all, I'm starting to think Miyazaki's public persona as a nice grandfather figure was meticulously manufactured by Ghibli or the media, but that's just a random conspiracy theory. Second of all, this is why I'm skeptical about How Do You Live. He might just be creating something for the sake of it, because even though he's old and has less energy, it's his way of occupying himself, making life seem less draining. I'm making this video while the coronavirus epidemic is going on. I'm currently working on something, this video, to occupy myself. It's kind of like that, except his film is better than this video probably. I might be wrong about How Do You Live, but even if it turns out to be the best film he's ever made, that doesn't stop me from being worried about the quality of the studio's future films. No, not just Miyazaki's movies, the studio's movies in general. Which lets me smoothly transition to... This film really doesn't feel like it was made by Studio Ghibli, rather by someone trying to copy Studio Ghibli. It has the story of a Disney Channel movie, not as icky and pandering, but still doesn't do much to make itself stand out. It's based on a pulp young adult manga, so a Japanese alternative to a Disney Channel movie. There's two main storylines. The first one is making sure this old building, which houses many of the school's clubs, doesn't get demolished, and the characters fix it to prevent this from happening. The second is the romance between the two leads. Both storylines are pretty basic. Let's start with the Clubhouse story. I'm struggling to think of anything to say about it. There really isn't a risk, the side characters occupying the clubhouse are all very one-note, whatever. What prevents the film from being incredibly forgettable is the romance story. Okay, so the main characters are even less interesting than the side characters, having nothing that defines them other than things like backstory, which aren't a replacement for personality. These are zero-note characters. One character falls in love with the other before the story even starts, and we never really figure out why. It's also hard to get a grasp on why that feeling is reciprocated. Ghibli has such a fantastic variety of great fantasy sequences and dream sequences, but when it's time for a dream sequence about how the female lead misses her mom and dad, what do they do to represent this? She reunites with her mom and dad. That's it. No creativity, no ingenuity, no out-of-the-box thinking, nothing. It's a perfect symbol for how unimaginative everything about this movie is. But the storyline has an amazing mishandling of a subject matter that makes this film infamous. It treats an incredibly creepy and taboo subject as if it's just another beat you'd see in any soap opera. You can never tell if the writers, a lady named Keiko Niwa, which I can find nothing about, and Hayao himself, either A, realized partway through this is a weird topic to tackle in a movie and pretended as if the topic isn't serious at all in order to kind of backpedal their way out of it, or B, this is actually how the movie's writers / the writers of the original manga view the subject, something that's not a big deal. Either way, the result is so strange and uncomfortable, it legitimately instigated a fight-or-flight response in me. I actually made this face while watching the movie, and I knew what it was going to tackle. I just wasn't prepared for how it was gonna do that. If it wasn't for that, this film might have been higher, but I would have had even less to say about it than I do now. Even the presentation isn't anything to write home about. The character design is unspecial, same for the soundtrack. The animation is serviceable, but not as good as Hayao Miyazaki or Takahata by a mile. This brings me to Goro again. Both of the films he's directed I've already included. The man may be a nice guy, but he's not talented. He's never made a good film. I know many beg to differ, but let me ask you this. 20 years from now, is this film going to be remembered the same way My Neighbor Totoro and Princess Mononoke are remembered today, even though it's been over 20 years since they came out? Is it even going to be remembered as fondly as something like Porco Rosso or Castle in the Sky? I personally don't think so, because it doesn't have a personality to call its own, beyond a big amusing flaw. I haven't seen Ronya the Robber's Daughter yet, which he directed, but at least in terms of visuals it looks atrocious. And now he's making yet another film in CG, which nobody, including me, is excited for. I already mentioned he and the studio are somewhat stuck together. They hired him in order to be the new Miyazaki, but the studio doesn't need another Miyazaki, it needs another visionary, with something important to say. That's what made Ghibli special, and this is not your guy. That's Goro now, the dude who makes the side projects. When Miyazaki's done for good, all they're gonna have is the side project son. Is Ghibli ever going to be the same? I hope they'll find a new talent, but that's really difficult. I just wish they focused on new talent rather than a specific Hayao replacement, because then we just get forgettable films.
Famously nicknamed as the next Miyazaki, Shinkai has certainly shaken up the anime film industry with his record-breaking 2016 feature, Your Name. Funny enough, Shinkai himself doesn't necessarily agree with all the critics that have dubbed him as the next Miyazaki. When asked about it in an interview, he says that Miyazaki is definitely an inspiration, and even name-checks Castle in the Sky as a major influence in his work. However, he also states he's a genius, but you can't be Miyazaki. You can only be the second Miyazaki. And that isn't something to aim for.